اللهم صل على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا ومولانا محمد وبارك وسلم صلاة وسلام عليك يا سيدي يا رسول الله وعلى آلك وصحبك يا سيدي يا حبيب الله. So overall in this chapter, Imam Tirmidhi rahimahullah ta'ala has narrated 5 different ahadith. There's different issues with relation to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's imamah. This is a well-established sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There's no disputing that. And not just for salah, not just for particular occasions, but generally speaking, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam wore his imamah very frequently, and most certainly the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam almost all times in any sort of public view, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's head was covered with some kind of head covering, either hat or imamah. So that's a well-established sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And in terms of prayer, there's certain narrations which mention multiplication of reward based on wearing an imamah for the prayer as well. In terms of the length, there's different narrations. There isn't a consensus as such amongst the ulama as to what the length of the imamah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was. There's different narrations. Some mention that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's imamah was 6 arm length, 6 zira. Some mention 7, and there's some narrations which mention 2 different lengths as well. That the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had some imamahs that were shorter and some that were longer. So the shorter ones at around 6 to 7 arm lengths or zira, and the longer ones at about 12, so twice as long. And in terms of colour as well, this is not something that Imam Tirmidhi rahimahullah ta'ala he actually comments on in this particular chapter. The size or the colour, etc., isn't something that's mentioned in this chapter. But in terms of colour, there's 3 colours, to the best of my knowledge, that are mentioned in a hadith with reference to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's imam. Black is the most common, and then white, and also white cloth that's been dyed with saffron, so saffron coloured white cloth. I don't, to the best of my knowledge, there isn't any other narration regarding any other colour. Again, as with good deeds, the reward really is dependent upon niyyah. Innamal a'malu binniyat. And so, if someone wears a turban, it could be any colour in the world, but if his sincere intention is to fulfill that sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then I'm not really the one to say whether he's going to be rewarded or not, or what kind of reward he's going to receive, because that's up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and reward is absolutely agreed upon, and it's understood that reward is based upon intention. So with that intention, that's then between that servant, that abd, between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in terms of his intention and his reward. But those are the colours that are mentioned in terms of from a hadith with reference to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself. In terms of the manner, the method, well, with that again, there are narrations which mention not to expose the head from the middle of the turban, so that's either by covering with the cloth or having a hat or something underneath. In terms of the ends of the turban, usually you have one end which is left free, which is left which is left loose. Now there's different narrations of the Prophet ﷺ. There are narrations even which mention that the Prophet ﷺ completely used all the cloth of the turban and did not leave any loose ends. So that's mentioned, that's narrated as well. Then you have narrations where it's mentioned that one end of the turban was left loose and the last end where you'd finish wrapping up was tucked into the turban. There's only one loose end. And even with that, there's different narrations regards how that was kept by the Prophet ﷺ. So some narrations mention that it was left directly trailing behind the back, so in between the shoulders and just left trailing behind. And there's one narration which mentions that it was left draped over the right shoulder. And then there's those narrations which mention that the Prophet ﷺ left some part of both ends of the turban outside. Right? So you have the end that you'd start with, which is usually trailing, but also at the end as well, the Prophet ﷺ would leave that outside as well. So you see a whole different variety of narrations. The last one is in particular with the initial end that's left out, that's left trailing. The most popular narration amongst the ulama does seem to be that it was left to trail behind, over the back. So you have a variety of different narrations there in terms of how the imamah of the Prophet ﷺ was done. And in fact, in some of the ahadith as well, it's mentioned, the first hadith that Sayyidina Jabir radiallahu ta'ala narrates in this chapter is regarding the Prophet ﷺ entering the city of Makkah and the Prophet ﷺ having an imamah on his head at the time. And so this seems to, and it actually specifies that it was a black imamah. And you see in most of the narrations here in this chapter, the only color that's mentioned in all 5 narrations that are narrated in this chapter where the color is mentioned, the only color that's mentioned is black. In this hadith it mentions about entering the city of Makkah on the day of the conquest. And in the previous chapter, in which the helmet of the Prophet ﷺ was under discussion, was the topic of discussion. In that chapter, the hadith which mentions that the Prophet ﷺ was wearing a helmet, when he entered the city on the day of the conquest. And there seems to be a contradiction then between these two narrations. That was the Prophet ﷺ wearing a helmet or was he wearing a turban? And there's different ways that the ulama have reconciled between this, but the very, very simple, the two really simple sort of ways that they've reconciled, one being that the turban can easily be wrapped around the helmet or even underneath the helmet as well to provide some kind of comfort or relief in terms of the helmet would have been made of metal. And so that's possible. Or the other simple way to reconcile is that the Prophet ﷺ, as he entered the city, had the helmet on his blessed head, and then he took that off, and the Prophet ﷺ then wore the turban as he entered into the city, and so then there's no issues with that. And so the second hadith also mentions the Prophet ﷺ wearing a black imamah. The third hadith is in reality is just an extension of that as well, in which it mentions that the Prophet ﷺ was sitting on the minbar. The Sahabi says that I remember the Prophet ﷺ, I can visualize, I can see the Prophet ﷺ sitting on the minbar and addressing the people. And so it shows you the kind of devotion that they had for the Prophet ﷺ, that in reality it was a matter of closing the eyes and the Prophet ﷺ in front of them. But he again narrates about a black turban, and this narration, the ulama generally seem to think that this was just, this is not that same narration about the conquest of Makkah, it's a different one. Although it mentions the black imamah, this is something to do with one of the Jumu'ah khutbahs of the Prophet ﷺ, because in one narration of this particular hadith from this Sahabi, the word Jumu'ah is used. Right, that the Prophet ﷺ, and also there wasn't a mimbar, there wasn't a pulpit when the Prophet ﷺ entered Makkah al-Mukarramah. The mimbar was in Medina Munawwara. Right, so that indicates as well. And the fourth hadith is narrated by Sayyidina Abdullah bin Umar radiallahu ta'ala, who in this hadith then mentions where the Prophet ﷺ kept the shimla of his imama, the trailing end where it was kept, and in this hadith he mentions that it was left behind the back between the shoulders. And his student Nafi', he narrates that I saw Abdullah bin Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhuma wearing his imama in the same way. And he also mentions that he'd seen Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala anhu's grandson Qasim bin Muhammad bin Abu Bakr doing the same thing in his time as well. So some other references as well. And finally, the last hadith in this chapter is narrated by Sayyidina Abdullah bin Abbas radiallahu ta'ala, who again mentions the khutbah, and again in this one it's a black coloured imama that is mentioned. So you see that in all of those narrations mentioning the black imama of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And in that narration he actually mentions a cloth separately underneath the imama as well. I won't mention that too much because it's mentioned in a separate chapter by Imam Tirmidhi rahimahullah ta'ala coming up shortly. So that's the chapter regarding the imama. And as I mentioned, it's a well-established sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and should be practiced. And in terms of generally, in terms of head covering, I've mentioned to you. Also, do be careful in terms of from the Hanafi perspective, from the Hanafi madhab. It is our view that praying salah with the head uncovered is makruh. It's disliked. And people can argue until they're blue in the face, but the reality of it is, if you are a muqallid, you're following the teachings of Imam Abu Hanifa and his madhab, then you're bound to follow the rulings that are given in that madhab. And there is only one allowance which the Hanafi ulama have made, and that is that somebody who has reached that level of taqwa and sincerity in his ibadah, where because the head being covered is a sign of humility, but it's also in some places, in some cultures, in some places, in terms of situations, it's considered to be a mark of honor as well. And the removal of the headgear is considered to be a mark of humility. So unless somebody has reached that level of taqwa where he feels embarrassed to be standing in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with his head covered, with and sincerely his heart is that devoted to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then the ruling is different for that person. But what we would give to all be in that situation. Right? So just something that I thought I'd mention in passing there as we're talking about the imama and headgear. The next chapter is about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's loincloth or lower garment of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It was the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's habit to wear a loose cloth or loincloth around the waist rather than a trouser of any kind, shalwar or pajama or trouser of any kind. Although there's varying narrations again, some of them with varying degrees of authenticity as well. Some which mention that the Prophet ﷺ at some point in his life did actually wear pajama as well. Right? Others mention that the Prophet ﷺ, they don't mention about wearing, they do mention however about owning. It says that the Prophet ﷺ owned one. It doesn't specify that he wore it or not. And then some of the A'immah have commented there that why would you own something without the intention of using it or wearing it? So the intent most certainly is implied there in that way by the Prophet ﷺ owning it. And also there's other ahadith which mention the Prophet ﷺ's commending wearing the pajama or trouser of some kind as opposed to the loincloth, because it has greater it's better in terms of satar and concealing the aura. Right? There's no possibility of it becoming undone or the person becoming exposed. And so so bear that in mind as well, that Imam Tirmidhi, rahimahullah ta'ala, he's not mentioned anything about a pajama in terms of here. He's mentioned about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's dehband or lungi or whatever colloquial name you're familiar with, but in terms of a loose loincloth, something wrapped around the waist. And so that was the custom and the tradition amongst the Arabs at the time, and that was predominantly, other than if you accept that narration about the Prophet ﷺ on one occasion or on a rare occasion using the pajama, then that is the norm. That was the normal practice of the Prophet ﷺ. And in the narrations it mentions, first of all, a narration which is narrated from Sayyidah Aisha Siddiqa radiallahu ta'ala anha, who showed some people a shirt, or not even a shirt, rather a loose cloth, a cloak or loose cloth that was used as an upper garment, and then a lower garment, a loincloth, and in which those who saw this narrate that there were patches sewn into it, right, where it's become worn and then it's been fixed with patches. This is the clothing that Sayyidah Aisha Siddiqa radiallahu ta'ala anha showed them, and she said, this is what the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam left this dunya. So, number one, first and foremost, it shows you the detachment from the dunya of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is why I would have serious reservations in associating the word poverty with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in my humble opinion, I would feel that is perhaps degrading the status of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was not poor. Yes, he chose a humble existence and humble lifestyle, but by no means was he poor. Is the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself who says that he was given the option of being a messenger who is also a king, or simply a messenger who is an abd and servant to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's what he chose. And if he had commanded, the mountains would have turned to gold and walked with him. So this is the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But it's not just that. In terms of after the migration, and especially after Hudaybiyah and after sort of the Muslim territory began to expand, the Prophet ﷺ received so much money, goods, wealth that you wouldn't be able to imagine. Piles of gold and silver and other good things, huge amounts of them. But the Prophet ﷺ's method was that it would go and he would distribute it quicker than it came. No desire to retain any for himself at all. Brings to mind a narration of which Imam Nawawi has narrated in Riyadh al-Salihin about the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet ﷺ, on one occasion, he came into the masjid, he led the prayer. Immediately as he finished his prayer, he left the masjid, cutting through the middle of the rows, and went back to his residence, which was considered very unusual, which the Sahaba considered very unusual, and they got worried, thinking that what happened, why did the Prophet ﷺ leave so suddenly and in this manner? And the Prophet ﷺ came back with a small amount of gold. And he said, I remembered having this in my possession, and I don't want it in my possession. I don't want to be keeping this in my possession. And he gave it to the Sahaba to distribute amongst those who were in need. So we know, but this hadith here then tells you physically the kind of humility that the Prophet ﷺ chose for himself. In reality, there's so many people who adopted this. There's a narration about Sayyidina Umar Farooq radiallahu ta'ala coming late to Jummah. And he came and he apologized and he said that I'm late because I have only two pieces of clothing. I have only two sets of clothing. And that when one is dirty, that is washed, and I wear the other one. And that was the situation, but the one that I was wearing became dirty as well, so I had to take it off and wash it. And there's been many of the Sufiya and Awliya who've adopted this practice of having only two having one change of clothing, that's it, having two pieces of clothing, wearing one and washing the other one. And for many, the trigger, the motivation behind this, yes, also the example of the Prophet ﷺ, but at the same time, the motivation being that they have less to account for as well on the Day of Judgment. And it is definitely something for us to think about in terms of, especially the modern culture in terms of marketing and, branding of products, and, where one pair of shoes can cost several £100s. Something to think about. Anything, are you ready to, would you be ready to account for all of that on the Day of Judgment? Knowing that you're... Now, again, there's two different camps, there's different understanding amongst the Sufiya as well. Because I remember reading something about a particular, the names I forget, but I definitely recall reading something about two senior Sufiya and who sort of came across each other, and one of them was dressed very nicely, fine clothing and dressed very well, and the other one looked at him and made some kind of a resentful sort of a comment, saying that, look, he's claims to be a man of Allah, or appears to be a man of Allah, and you're dressed in this way. And the other one said, and so his response was, he said, and obviously this person was dressed very humbly, and he said, at least my physical state that I'm in isn't begging for people to give me money. Right? I'm not encouraging people to think that I'm in need of help by the way that I'm dressed. And وَأَمَّا بِنِعْمَةِ رَبِّكَ فَحَدِّثْ, to propagate the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it is considered miserly by the ulama for somebody who has the wealth, then chooses not to show it. So where's the balance? The balance is, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes this in the Quran, doesn't he? He says that the believers, the true believers, the muttaqeen are those who, when they spend, they are not wasteful, nor are they miserly, but they are in between. So what's that balance then, and how would you... And the thing that comes to mind is that for those who are going to keep some of that wealth, right, who are going to retain the wealth, then they should show gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by actually spending it and showing that Allah has blessed them. All the while obviously spending in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is always encouraged. And there's obviously a mandatory limit, which is zakat. Then beyond that you have nafal sadaqah as well, other forms of sadaqah and charity, which are always recommended and always encouraged. And in fact, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in more than a few places where He talks about the true sincere believers and the muttaqeen in the Quran, amongst their characteristics He mentions that they spend in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Surah Baqarah, right at the beginning. وَمِمَّا رَزَقْنَاهُمْ يُنْفِقُونَ. They spend from that which we have given them. Right? الَّذِينَ يُنْفِقُونَ فِي السَّرَّاءِ وَالضَّرَّاءِ. They spend in times of difficulty and in times of ease. And other places as well. And so, giving in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is necessary to attain this level of taqwa and piety. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that a person is obligated to give everything away, that he can't keep anything for himself or retain anything. But if he is going to do that, then he should not be simply hoarding, because then he just becomes a hoarder. Then it's clear that that blessing should be evident. And we see this, many of the great awliya who had means. Sayyidina Shaykh Abdul Qadir Jilani, rahimahullah ta'ala, later on in his life, after his sort of mujahadat and so on. Sayyidina Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala, very successful merchant by trade, Sayyidina Usman Ghani radiallahu ta'ala, and many of the other Sahaba. So it's not forbidden in any sense at all. But then look at how these people spent in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as well. Look at Sayyidina Usman radiallahu ta'ala, you won't find any other example like that. Look at Sayyidina Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala. Right? Even his trade was in reality ibadah and worship, because through his trade he was actually, it seems like his motivation was actually to look after people and to care for people. And he treated people and he priced his goods the way that, according to the person that was in front of him, was buying from him. The famous incident about the old lady who came to him, asked him for some cloth, because he was a cloth merchant by trade. What did he say to her? He said, take this cloth, and he literally gave it to her for a matter of pennies. And she turned around and she said, you are the great Imam Abu Hanifa and you mock me. I know this cloth is worth so much more. Why are you telling me it's only that I can have it for a few pennies? Are you trying to mock me? Are you trying to be cynical? And he said, no. He said, I purchased this whole roll of cloth for this amount of money. Now, the rest of the cloth that I've sold off the roll has given me back my investment. I'm only owed a few pennies for it. So take it. So this is not, there's many incidents like that. So you look at those people and look at their trade, and the fact is it brings you back to that reality. The English proverb is, money is the root of all evil. But what's the hadith? Hubbul mal. It's the love of money that's the root of all evil. That's what the Prophet said. Hubbul mal ra'su kulli khatiyah. There's a difference between the two proverbs. It's a massive difference. Money is not the root of all evil. The love of money and attachment with money and the dunya is the root of all evil. And so where you do find that they have retained that wealth for whatever purpose, you will find that the attachment and that love, is that greed and desire is not there. And that's why they're able to do that, to spend in this way. And so coming back to, that whole discussion is based around what? That the Prophet ﷺ left this dunya. And Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu anha, she says that in spite of, why show that this is, these are the kind of clothes that the Prophet ﷺ departed this world in? Because by the end of the physical lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, there had been many conquests, many areas were sending in their taxes and other things as well. There were huge amounts, massive amounts of money passing through the Prophet ﷺ's hands. And what it shows is that the Prophet ﷺ did not retain anything for himself. And in fact, he wore those garments that had been patched because they'd become worn out. And so that's one thing that's mentioned in that particular narration. And the coarse, thick fiber, that cloth, that's where what some ulama say that this is where the term Sufi actually comes from, because that type of cloth is known as Suf. And it's because of that association that the Sufiya began to adorn themselves in that that cloth which was seen as a sign of humility. And so they became known as the Sufis. And the other thing that Imam Tirmidhi rahimahullah ta'ala, he mentions in this chapter, in total in this chapter there's 4 ahadith which have been mentioned in this chapter. The other thing that he mentions in the remaining sort of 3 ahadith really is about how the loincloth, that's very, very clear that the Prophet ﷺ's normal routine was to wear a loincloth. The other thing is how it's worn. And in those ahadith it mentions that the Prophet ﷺ not only wore it above the ankles, sort of halfway down his blessed legs and calves, shins, but also commandments from the Prophet ﷺ for men to wear their loincloth in that way. Now, one thing is that these narrations, they all mention the loincloth. Doesn't mention the pyjama or shalwar or anything of that nature. However, I have to say this, and I'm not afraid of saying this, that sometimes we become so engrossed with disputes that we lose focus of the actual sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so yes, this has become, especially within the culture of the subcontinent, this became a major point of discussion, and where the loincloth and then later, the shalwar or pajama or whatever was customary in that culture, where it should be worn. But the reality of it is, no one denies, and it's practically a consensus, that the Prophet ﷺ forbade the loincloth covering the ankles. That is a sunnah, established sunnah and command of the Prophet ﷺ. And because it's commanded, therefore doing the opposite of it is reprehensible as well. That's something to take into consideration. That is the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And in these ahadith, it actually mentions that the Prophet ﷺ saying that halfway down the calves, or a little below that, or the last limit that the Prophet ﷺ mentioned of allowance being just above the ankles. And so I recall some of our shuyukh saying as well, especially then going back to that culture in the subcontinent and so on, saying that we obviously don't deliberately disobey a commandment of the Prophet ﷺ, but at the same time differentiate and distinguish between yourself and others. So if there's, and again, this is something where you have to understand and look at the ahadith and the wording and so on. Right? It nowhere does it imply that you to expose your whole legs up to the knees. That's not said or implied in any hadith. But then again, in terms of, you can see this happening from both sides. It seems like from one side it's become such an issue, and that it's been taken to the limits where people walking around with their shalwars just below the knees, which is again not, this is not the teaching of the sunnah. But yes, it is an established sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ for the lower garment for the males to be above the ankles. And that's something to be taken into consideration. It's not something to be looked at lightly as well. Yes, there's a illah, there's a reason there. The reasoning being, the Prophet ﷺ said that this is a mark of the arrogant, and that those, it will become a means, it will become a means of those ankles being punished in the hellfire. Those who, but then again, that reasoning then changes with differing cultures and times. Is that in a different culture, is that considered to be, if it's not considered to be a mark of arrogance, then what? Then at the same time, you also have allowances as well. Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala, being one person, it was given an allowance by the Prophet ﷺ. And so, this is something, it is a matter of a little contention. The safest option is, it is definitely commanded in the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. There's no denying that, and so should be followed. And so follow it, but also differ from others as well, who are basically will take it to the last limit, and so wear your shalwar or loincloth just above the ankles. That's advice given to us by some of our shuyukh. Yes.
Some people, I mean, this mentions the lower garment. Some people also wear the jubba or kahaf there. Like, do they take proof from these ahadith or do they get that from elsewhere?
I don't recall anything specifically relating to the jubba in that manner. But traditionally, do remember that the qamis of the Arabs would have been sort of above the ankles anyway. So that's something else. One thing, a point to think about though, however, is, yes, the ulama have given that justification about the reasoning being arrogance, because arrogance is not there. But what if there's no reason for that? What if somebody is using that as a means to deliberately disobey this instruction? That's something that's always caused me a lot of turmoil myself. In that, yes, the reasoning is there, but when does it stop becoming a reasoning and actually become arrogance, where you're actually using that deliberately not to act upon a commandment of the Prophet ﷺ? So in reality, that's how it should be. It should be above the ankles. That is the command of the Prophet ﷺ. That is the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. The other thing as well is in terms of salah. Right? So it's not just for salah. This instruction is always. It's not just for the prayer. And the actual instruction itself is actually regarding just the loincloth. Then people have extended that to other garments. That again is a point which can be questioned and contested. That should it fall over onto other garments? Especially when there's a reasoning there, which was that in that culture they had huge long pieces of cloth trailing behind them as a mark of arrogance and how big somebody was. It was a matter of pride, which doesn't exist anymore. And so that's definitely something that can be, where questions can be asked. But the problem is that it's been misinterpreted again in terms of assuming that this ruling is just for salah, where you find people happily walking along with their trousers or shalwar or whatever it is, trailing underneath their feet outside of namaz, and then when they come to namaz, they start folding up the trousers. Now again, this is not the correct manner. This is wrong. So as Hanafis, again, I'll give you the simple answer. We can sit here and go through the whole discussions of the background, but this is the whole point of being muqallid, which is that, alhamdulillah, we're not under obligation to look at every single justification and piece of evidence. When our imams have said it, we follow it, trusting on their judgment. And it's a very interesting discussion in itself about taqleed and whether it's permitted or not, and what the benefits are, and what in reality the destruction of not having taqleed is, perhaps for another course or something. Very interesting discussion. But the fact is, we are muqallid. And for us, the ruling is that wearing your clothes in any manner which is deemed to be unconventional or unnatural in terms of the way that clothing would be worn is not permitted in salah. And that includes kaffu thawb, rolling up the clothes, either from above or below, is not permitted. And the ulama have directly addressed this issue. Let's say somebody's in that situation where the trousers are naturally, or shalwar or whatever, is falling below the ankles. Should he fold, or should he pray with his clothes, with his ankles covered? And the ulama have explicitly stated that he should pray with his ankles covered, because the prohibition of praying with your clothes in that unconventional manner is worse than it is in terms of praying with your ankles covered. So that's another issue that's resolved in this discussion here as well in terms of fiqh. If you're in that situation, unless, and the example that I would give you is, for example, you've got an interview at college or university, or you're going for a job interview, would you go with your trouser leg of your suit folded halfway up to your shins? Would you? I don't think you would. Which is evidence that that's not the conventional way that those clothes are supposed to be worn. Which is not permitted in that. And it, logically, doesn't that make sense that you wouldn't want to present yourself in front of a panel who's looking at your dissertation, or who's going to give you a job or whatever, and then you're going to go in front of Allah in that way? So there's logical justification there as well. So if that is the situation, then don't bother folding. Then pray the way you feel that those clothes ought to be worn. And that's what's mentioned in this particular chapter. Right, we'll have to stop there. And inshallah we'll pick it up from there next time. So the next chapter we're moving on to here is wudu. It's ablution in terms of the fiqh. The commandment for wudu is from the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu idha qumtum ila salah. O believers, when you stand for the prayer, that means when you make the intention of praying, when you wish to pray. فَاغْسِلُوا وُجُوهَكُمْ وَأَيْدِيَكُمْ إِلَى الْمَرَافِقِ. Wash your faces and wash your arms up to the elbows. وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ. Do masah of your heads. وَأَرْجُلَكُمْ إِلَى الْكَعْبَيْنِ. And wash your feet up to the ankles. This is Surah 5, verse number 6. Surah Al-Ma'idah, Surah number 5, verse number 6. And so the Prophet ﷺ also said that Allah doesn't accept the prayer of any one of you if he's in a state of minor ritual impurity until he performs wudu. The Prophet ﷺ also, now there's many ahadith related to wudu, that wudu is the key to salah, and salah is the key to Jannah, and so on. The term wudu literally means cleanliness. It's actually pronounced in three different ways in terms of the waw. It's pronounced with dhamma, fatha and kasra on the waw, all three vowels, wudu, wadu and widu. And in all three situations it means different things. It means the water that you use for wudu. It also can mean the container that you're using with the water in it, or it can mean the act of purification, and the correct pronunciation for that would be wudu. And there's different types of wudu. Wudu can be fard. For example, if you are going to pray and you're in a state of impurity, then you need to do wudu. Then it's obligatory, it's fard. And it can be wajib as well, so in terms of praying, touching the Quran, not reading, touching the Quran, it's fard to have wudu, it's necessary. For tawaf, it's wajib, because that ruling is expressed from the Prophet ﷺ. There's a dispute there as to what the obligation is regarding wudu, what the command is from the Quran, and what the Prophet ﷺ's instructions are. And so the way it's reconciled in the Hanafi madhab is that in tawaf or during tawaf, wudu is considered to be wajib. If you do tawaf without wudu, then you're liable to pay a penalty. And also it can be recommended and desirable. And so there's many situations where wudu is desirable and recommended. Amongst them is wanting to sleep in a state of purity, and it's generally, there's a practice that's been popular amongst the Sufiya, which is to remain in wudu at all times. So literally, when your wudu breaks, to make wudu straight away and to remain in wudu all the time. And that in itself, because remember, it's a major question that people ask, and people have this ongoing discussion about the inwardly and outwardly. The reality of it is that they're both related. Whatever you're doing in terms of whatever your body is experiencing on the outward will affect the internal workings as well, in terms of the spirit and the soul, and the other way around. So they're very, very closely related. And so this act of trying to remain constantly in a state of wudu and purification is something that actually helps to strengthen the soul and the inner self as well. And so amongst these occasions, it's recommended, for example, entering the city of Medina to do ghusl and then to make wudu every time when visiting the Prophet ﷺ, while in the city of Medina Munawwara, and many other occasions as well. When someone's in a state of anger, the Prophet ﷺ said that anger is from the shaitan, and shaitan is made of fire. Use water to put out that fire, in other words, do wudu. So there's other occasions as well. So based on that, as mentioned, essentially 3 different types of wudu: fard, wajib, and mustahab, or desirable. As you should already know, again, each act that you do in terms of any kind of worship or any kind of obligation in terms of the Sharia, there'll be different aspects to that obligation. There'll be certain things that you have to do in order to fulfill that obligation, and they become fard and wajib. And there'll be other things that are recommended for you to do, but if you don't do them, whatever action you're doing may still be deemed valid. And so sunnah and mustahab, all different types of them come into that category. So those things that you're required to do in order to attain this state of purity, there's 4 of them. There are those 4 which are mentioned in the Quran. What does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say? فَاغْسِلُوا وُجُوهَكُمْ, wash your faces, and wash your arms up to the elbows, do masah of the head, and wash your feet up to the ankles. These 4 things which are mentioned in the Quran, these are the fara'id of wudu. If any part of these is left incomplete, it means that that person is not in a state of purity. If that was the reason why he was doing wudu, was to bring himself into a state of purity, of tahara, he's not achieved that. Any prayer that's prayed subsequently will be invalid. Anything that requires wudu in order to be done, any act of worship subsequently, will be invalid. It will be considered as if he's not even started it, right? Because it's a precondition for salah. Within that, there's certain things that need to then be remembered, like, for example, ensuring that every part of those limbs is washed properly, the elbows and the heel in particular, right, which if due care is not taken, can remain unwashed or dry. What results is a massive wasted effort in that, the whole effort of doing wudu and any ibadah that comes after it, which is why diligence should be taken when doing wudu. There's a lot of reward for this. The Prophet, there's many ahadith which mentions that somebody does wudu and does wudu thoroughly. In those words where the Prophet has commended that someone who does wudu and does it thoroughly. What does that mean? This is exactly what it means, making sure that the wudu is done properly. And so, again, in terms of if there's anything on those parts of the skin which would stop water from getting to the skin underneath, this will have to be removed. If it can be removed without causing pain or severe discomfort, it will have to be removed. Right? And so that will include any kind of cosmetics and anything else. Right? In terms of the fingernails as well, traditionally, if someone's kneading dough, making atta, then that can dry under the nails and can prevent water from getting to the fingertips. Again, it needs to be removed if possible without causing pain or injury. All of these things need to be taken into consideration. If someone's wearing jewelry, ring, whatever, if that's preventing water from getting to the skin, that needs to be resolved either by taking it off entirely if it easily comes off, or moving it around the finger, ensuring that parts that are underneath it of the finger are washed. The masa, that's 1/4 of the head, and that's the Hanafi madhab, that fard is 1/4 of the head, and then the recommendations are to do masa of the entire head. Right? That's based on a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, in which the Prophet ﷺ is narrated to have done masa over just 1/4 of the head. Right? For those of you who do understand Arabic briefly, that hadith is the hadith of Sayyidina Mughira bin Shu'bah radiallahu ta'ala, and the wording is that the Prophet ﷺ did masa on his forelock, masaha ala nasiya. Nasiya in Arabic is often misunderstood or misinterpreted by those who translate as forehead. This is not forehead, it means forelock. And that answers for you another question as well. Allah says in the Quran that people will be seized by their forelocks, nawasi. That's the word that's used in the Quran. They'll be seized by the forelock. How do you seize someone by the forehead? Yes, there's other, the Prophet said, and Allah mentioned about people walking on their faces, and the Prophet answered that when the Sahaba asked, how is someone going to walk on the face? He said, if Allah can make you walk on your feet, He can make you walk on your face as well. So not in that context, but just something to consider as well. But nasiya actually means the forelock. That's the front part of the head here. And what the hadith implies is that the Prophet ﷺ did masa of the head just by brushing his hand over this front part of the head. And that's roughly 1/4 of the head. And so that's where that ruling comes from. That's the minimal amount that we find in any narration where the Prophet ﷺ has done masa, which has been narrated. And that's why, for us, in terms of the Hanafi madhab, that becomes the standard. There's no hadith which mentions the Prophet ﷺ having done masa on any portion less than that 1/4 or nasiya, as it's referred to. In terms of things which are sunnah during wudu, so to make intention, this is an emphatic sunnah. But do remember that niyyah and intention is what? It is an act of the heart. Iradatul qalb. So intention is to do with the heart. And so saying, however, with the tongue, verbally, is good, it's recommended, but the actual sunnah is fulfilled by having that thought in your heart, in your mind at that time. Right? Words do not need to be uttered to constitute niyyah, it's an act of the heart. Why we say verbally, or why people say verbally, why is it taught, is because what comes onto the tongue then helps to solidify what's in the heart and the mind. And for that reason it's good and recommended. Especially if somebody is easily distracted. So, like for example, and we'll discuss this when we get there, that the condition for salah is also what? Niyyah. When does that niyyah need to take place? It needs to take place the moment that you're saying Allahu Akbar. If somebody is very easily distracted, it's quite easy to say Allahu Akbar with a completely blank and vacant mind and heart, and enter into the salah not knowing what he's doing and what he's praying. Right? So, something to consider. There's obvious advantages there, but it's not necessary the niyyah is not necessary from the Hanafi perspective in wudu anyway, because water is considered to be a natural purifier. Allah says so in the Quran. He sent down water so that it could purify. Right? So no niyyah required, but it's sunnah, and so it's good to do. And to say it with words is better because it solidifies that which is in the heart. And so just to say that I'm intending to perform ablution to come closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or so that I to remove impurity, or so that I can pray, anything like that. To read Bismillah at the beginning, this is also an emphatic sunnah. Washing both hands up to the wrists 3 times before beginning wudu. This is non-emphatic sunnah. And if there's any possibility or suspicion of physical impurity on the hands, then it becomes emphatic. Brushing the teeth, miswak, a very, very emphatic sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. One of the last things that the Prophet ﷺ did before he departed from this mortal world was what? The Prophet ﷺ did miswak. Right? The hadith of Sayyidah Aisha Siddiqa radiallahu ta'ala anha, she says that amongst her own virtues and accolades, she counted the fact that she says that one of my virtues is that the Prophet ﷺ departed from this world with his head on my chest, and that Allah had mixed my saliva with his saliva before he departed from this world. How? Someone brought a miswak and the Prophet ﷺ wished to use it, and because the Prophet ﷺ had been through a prolonged illness of many days by that point, she asked if she should soften the front of the miswak by chewing it for the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ allowed her, permitted her to do this, and she did. And so this was one of the last things that the Prophet ﷺ did before he left this mortal world. But also the Prophet ﷺ's instructions, there's many, many instructions about the miswak, and to the effect that the Prophet ﷺ, to the extent that he said that if I didn't fear it becoming obligatory, I would have commanded you to do miswak with all of your 5 prayers. And so to do miswak is sunnah, and the true sunnah is the miswak, and there's many virtues and blessings for it. Even in this modern age, you can buy the most expensive toothbrush in the world, and it won't give you the benefit of acting on the precise sunnah of the Prophet. Generally and vaguely you are, in terms of dental and oral hygiene, but not specifically. That should be the biggest motivator to have a miswak as well. But at the same time, it's a natural and purely natural sort of alternative, something to consider as well. If you don't have a miswak to hand, then using the index finger of the right hand to, in the manner of a miswak, will it is hoped that will acquire the sawab, the reward for the miswak. And rinsing the mouth 3 times, again an emphatic sunnah, even if it's done with 1 handful of water, you don't have to get fresh water every time, and such that it engulfs the entire mouth. Rinsing the nose 3 times, also an emphatic sunnah with 3 different handfuls of water. Look at the level of scrutiny and care in terms of hygiene there, that being permitted, or that being part of the sunnah, that you don't need a fresh handful of water for rinsing your mouth, but fresh handful of water when you rinse your nose 3 times. It's quite intriguing when you look into the little details like this. This is where you get that real sense of that hadith, at-tuhuru shatrul iman, cleanliness is half of iman. And it's sunnah also to exaggerate in rinsing the nose and the mouth, gargling for example, and then also cleaning the nose with the left hand, using the small finger as well to cleanse the cavities and so on, nasal cavities. And this is all sunnah, but only this exaggeration is for those who are not fasting. If you're fasting, then be careful, because even the slightest amount of water that goes, that trickles down the throat, even if it's accidentally, it will invalidate the fast. Don't sacrifice your fast at the cost of rinsing your mouth too thoroughly. Khilal, combing through the thick beard, non-emphatic sunnah, and that is to separate the hairs from the bottom end to the chin by facing the backs of the hands towards the neck after washing the face 3 times. And combing through the fingers, or khilal, the fingers, the toes, the emphatic sunnah. So the method is mentioned there as well. And this method with regards to the hands is to enter the fingers of one hand into the other hand, to interlace the fingers basically. And with regards to the feet is to enter any one finger of the hand into the toes of the feet. It is preferable to use the small finger of the left hand, beginning from the small finger of the right toe, and so on. And washing 3 times of all the parts of the body that are washed, so the face, the arms, and so on. The first one would be, those parts that are fard, the first one would be fard and obligatory, the next 2 would be emphatic sunnah. Continuity, doing wudu, so continuity, what does that mean? Continuity means to complete your wudu, complete washing of one limb before the previous limb dries. So washing your arms before the face dries, washing your left arm before the right arm dries, and so on. Right, this is sunnah. So technically speaking, and this is an interesting question to ask because you get a whole variety of answers whenever you do. Technically speaking, if somebody was to wash their face and the arms and do masah of the head at home and then travel to the masjid, however long it takes him, and go and wash the feet in the masjid, that person's wudu would be valid as long as he's not done anything to break his wudu in between, because obviously then he has to start all over again. But as long as he's not done anything to invalidate in between, because this continuity is sunnah, it's not fard or wajib. So by delaying to that extent, it won't invalidate the wudu. And that's sort of 10 of the sunnahs that we've looked at. We can pick up from there. Next time, as we're coming towards the close of the session. Any questions before we wrap up?
So I've been taught that as Hanafis, our namaz is only valid behind an imam if his namaz is valid according to our opinion, no matter which school he follows. Is this also kind of the same thing in the other madhahib as well?
I would assume so, yeah. Because if I'm doing something that according to somebody is actually contravening the laws of salah and leaving my salah invalid, rendering it invalid, then the whole principle of following is what? That person's prayer should be sound, otherwise yours is not going to be.
If a person thinks he may be put in that position where he lead people of other madhabs, is he then obligated to learn all 4?
Yes and no. Because there's some situations where he will not be able to follow all 4. But in those things which can be avoided and remedied, for example, wudu is a common one. There's certain situations where in the Hanafi madhab, your wudu doesn't break. Let's say in the Shafi'i madhab, your wudu according to them has broken. It's recommended for somebody to know those differences. And if there's a mixed congregation, then to actually cater for that as well. Or even, for example, with Jum'ah, the rulings of khutbah are different. According to the Ahnaf, just saying Alhamdulillah once is enough to cover the obligation of khutbah. According to other madhahib, there isn't. You need to have elements of talqeen, of taqwa, and other things in there as well. So it is a responsibility to a degree to know, so that if you can accommodate for everyone. The only color that's mentioned in all five narrations that are narrated in this chapter, where the color is mentioned, the only color that's mentioned is black. In this hadith, it mentions about entering the city of Makkah on the day of the conquest. And in the previous chapter, in which the helmet of the Prophet ﷺ was under discussion, was the topic of discussion. In that chapter, the hadith which mentions that the Prophet ﷺ was wearing a helmet, when he entered the city on the day of the conquest. And there seems to be a contradiction then between these two narrations. That was the Prophet ﷺ wearing a helmet, or was he wearing a turban? And there's different ways that the ulama have reconciled between this, but very, very simple, the two really simple sort of ways that they've reconciled, one being that the turban can easily be wrapped around the helmet, or even underneath the helmet as well, to provide some kind of comfort or relief, in terms of the helmet would have been made of metal. And so that's possible. Or the other simple way to reconcile is that the Prophet ﷺ, as he entered the city, had the helmet on his blessed head, and then he took that off, and the Prophet ﷺ then wore the turban as he entered into the city, and so then there's no issues with that. And so the second hadith also mentions the Prophet ﷺ wearing a black imama. The third hadith is, in reality, is just an extension of that as well, in which finished wrapping up was tucked into the turban. There's only one loose end. And even with that, there's different narrations regards how that was kept by the Prophet ﷺ. So some narrations mention that it was left directly trailing behind the back, so in between the shoulders, and just left trailing behind. And there's one narration which mentions that it was left draped over the right shoulder. And then there's those narrations which mention that the Prophet ﷺ left some part of both ends of the turban outside. Right? So you have the end that you'd start with, which is usually trailing, but also at the end as well, the Prophet ﷺ would leave that outside as well. So you see a whole different variety of narrations. The last one is in particular with the initial end that's left out, that's left trailing. The most popular narration amongst the ulama does seem to be that it was left to trail behind, over the back. So you have a variety of different narrations there in terms of how the imamah of the Prophet ﷺ was done. And in fact, in some of the hadiths as well, it's mentioned, the first hadith that Sayyidina Jabir radiallahu ta'ala narrates in this chapter is regarding the Prophet ﷺ entering the city of Makkah, and the Prophet ﷺ having an imamah on his head at the time. And so this seems to, and it actually specifies that it was a black imamah. And you see in most of the narrations here in this chapter, Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Mawlana Muhammad wa ala Sayyidina Mawlana Muhammad wa barik wa sallim. Salatu wa salamun alayka ya Sayyidi ya Rasulullah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ya Sayyidi ya Habiballah. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So overall in this chapter, Imam Tirmidhi rahimahullah ta'ala has narrated 5 different ahadith. There's different issues with relation to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's imamah. This is a well-established sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There's no disputing that. And not just for salah, not just for particular occasions, but generally speaking, the Prophet ﷺ wore his amama very frequently, and most certainly the Prophet ﷺ almost all times in any sort of public view, the Prophet ﷺ's head was covered with some kind of head covering, either hat or imam. So that's a well-established sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And in terms of prayer, there's certain narrations which mention multiplication of reward based on wearing an imamah for the prayer as well. In terms of the length, there's different narrations. There isn't a consensus as such amongst the ulama. Your intention is to fulfill that sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, then I'm not really the one to say whether he's going to be rewarded or not, or what kind of reward he's going to receive, because that's up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and reward is absolutely, it's agreed upon, and it's understood that reward is based upon intention. So with that intention, that's then between that servant, that abd, between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in terms of his intention and his reward. But those are the colours that are mentioned in terms of from a hadith with reference to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself. In terms of the manner, the method, well, with that again, there are narrations which mention not to expose the head from the middle of the turban, so that's either by covering with the cloth or having a hat or something underneath. In terms of the ends of the turban, usually you have one end which is left free, which is left which is left loose. Now there's different narrations of the Prophet ﷺ. There are narrations even which mention that the Prophet ﷺ completely used all the cloth of the turban and did not leave any loose ends. So that's mentioned, that's narrated as well. Then you have narrations where it's mentioned that one end of the turban was left loose and the last end where you'd ask to what the length of the imamah of the Prophet ﷺ was. There's different narrations. Some mention that the Prophet ﷺ's imamah was 6 arm length, 6 zira. Some mention 7, and there's some narrations which mention 2 different lengths as well. That the Prophet ﷺ had some imamahs that were shorter and some that were longer. So the shorter ones at around 6 to 7 arm lengths or zira, and the longer ones at about 12, so twice as long. And in terms of colour as well, this is not something that Imam Tirmidhi rahimahullah ta'ala, he actually comments on in this particular chapter. The size or the colour, etc., isn't something that's mentioned in this chapter. But in terms of colour, there's 3 colours, to the best of my knowledge, that are mentioned in a hadith with reference to the Prophet ﷺ imam. Black is the most common, and then white, and also white cloth that's been dyed with saffron, so saffron coloured white cloth. I don't, to the best of my knowledge, there isn't any other narration regarding any other colour. Again, as with good deeds, the reward really is dependent upon niyyah. Innamal a'malu binniyat. And so, if someone wears a turban, it could be any colour in the world, but if his sincere